I remember the exact moment everything changed. It was a Sunday evening in February 2021, and I had just come home from service before my husband. The house was quiet, that specific kind of silence that comes right before dinner, when the radiators tick and the light from the windows starts to fade into something softer, more amber. I could hear the furnace humming in the basement, a steady sound that had been the background music of our lives for nearly 2 decades. I picked up his Bible from the side table where he'd left it that morning, the leather cover worn smooth from years of handling, and carried it to the mantel, setting it in the spot where he always kept it, centered beneath the framed photograph of his parents taken at their 50th anniversary. As I placed it down, adjusting it so the spine was perfectly parallel to the edge of the mantel, a small piece of paper slid out from between the pages and landed on the wood surface with a whisper of a sound. Thermal paper, the kind that fades if you leave it in sunlight too long, the kind that prints receipts at gas stations and restaurants. I picked it up and unfolded it carefully, my fingers moving slowly, deliberately. The date was 2 nights earlier. Thursday, February 11th. The merchant name meant nothing to me at first, just a string of letters that didn't form any word I recognized, some business name designed to be discreet, forgettable. But the itemized charges did mean something. Room. Champagne. Private dance. $347.18. I stood there holding it, the paper light in my hand, listening to the clock in the hallway tick through the seconds, and something inside me went very still. Not angry. Not surprised. Not even hurt, not yet. Just still, like water before it freezes. I set the receipt under the brass lamp on the mantel and walked to the kitchen to make tea. That night, I didn't say a word. I didn't confront him. I didn't cry. I labeled a manila envelope with the date in my careful handwriting and wrote one line in my planner, the daily planner I'd been keeping for 15 years, the one with my work schedule and grocery lists and reminders. Begin telling the truth to myself. Marion Holt had been married for 22 years. She was 52 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall, with short graying hair she kept trimmed every 6 weeks at a salon near her office. She wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, simple silver studs in her ears, and sensible shoes that didn't pinch by the end of the day. She worked as a payroll manager at a dental clinic on the north side of Columbus, Ohio, a practice with 3 dentists, 2 hygienists, and an office staff of 7. She left the house at 7:45 every morning, arrived at work by 8:15, and returned home by 5:30 unless there was a staff meeting or end-of-month processing. She made dinner while listening to public radio, usually something simple, chicken and vegetables, pasta with sauce from a jar, soup and bread. She had a system for everything, bills paid on the 15th of each month, groceries purchased on Thursdays after work, laundry sorted by color and temperature and done on Saturday mornings while the house was still quiet. People who worked with her said she was steady, reliable, the kind of person who remembered birthdays and never missed a deadline, who could find an error in a spreadsheet just by looking at the numbers, who kept the office running smoothly without drama or complaint. Her husband, Daniel, was 55 years old, a contractor who specialized in residential additions and kitchen remodels. He'd been in construction since he was 19, working his way up from framing to project management, and now ran a small company with 2 employees and a rotating roster of subcontractors. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a deep voice that carried authority, the kind of man people listened to at meetings and gatherings. He taught Sunday school at the church they had attended since they moved to Columbus from Toledo in 2003, a mid-sized evangelical congregation that met in a renovated warehouse with exposed beams and contemporary worship music. He was known for his speeches about integrity, about keeping vows, about what it meant to be a man of principle in a world that had lost its moral compass. He organized charity dinners twice a year, fundraisers for the local food bank and homeless shelter, and served on the building committee, overseeing maintenance and renovation projects. People trusted him. They called him for advice, asked him to pray before potlucks, and invited him to speak at men's retreats. Marian had trusted him too, in the way you trust someone after 2 decades of shared routines, shared bills, shared silence. She'd trusted him the way you trust gravity, without thinking about it, because it had always been there. But that Sunday evening, holding a slip of paper that smelled faintly of ink and cologne she didn't recognize, she understood that trust and knowledge were not the same thing. Trust was a feeling, a habit, a default setting. Knowledge was something else. Knowledge required evidence. Daniel came home 20 minutes later at 6:38 according to the clock on the microwave. Marian heard his truck in the driveway, the diesel engine rumbling before cutting off, then the slam of the driver's door and his footsteps on the front walk. He was humming when he came through the door, a tuneless melody he produced when he felt he'd done something admirable, when the day had gone well, and he was pleased with himself. He carried a bouquet of grocery store flowers, daisies wrapped in cellophane with a bright yellow bow, the kind they sold near the registers for $9.99. He set them on the kitchen counter with a careful smile, the smile he used when he wanted to show he'd been thinking of her, and bent to kiss her cheek, the same quick press of lips he'd been giving her for years, automatic as a handshake. "Thanks for putting the Bible back," he said, his voice warm and easy, the voice of a man with nothing to hide. He glanced toward the mantel, checking that it was in its proper place. The house looked centered. Marian nodded and turned toward the stove, where a pot of water was beginning to boil. "Do you want soup?" she asked, her voice neutral, unchanged. "I'm full," he said, loosening his tie. Church lunch ran long. They had sandwiches and that potato salad Mrs. Henderson makes. Marian nodded again. She hadn't attended the lunch. She'd come home early to finish the quarterly payroll reports for the clinic, reconciling hours and benefits, making sure everything was balanced before the Monday deadline. He moved into the living room, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor, and turned on the television to the Weather Channel, the volume just loud enough to hear from the kitchen. He settled into his recliner, the brown leather chair he'd bought when they first moved to the house, and Marian heard the creak of the mechanism as he adjusted it. She folded towels in the hallway, her hands moving through the motions automatically, fold in half lengthwise, then in thirds, stack by size, while her mind worked somewhere else entirely, processing information, cataloging facts, and beginning to build a timeline. When she returned to the mantel 10 minutes later, moving quietly, the receipt was gone. She looked at the spot where she'd placed it, under the brass lamp her mother had given them as a wedding present, and saw only the polished wood surface. She didn't ask. She didn't search his pockets or the trash can or the Bible itself. She simply went to her office, the small second bedroom they'd converted into a workspace years ago, opened the manila envelope she had already labeled, and wrote the merchant's name in the top right corner in blue ink, careful block letters. No outrage. No tears. No confrontation. Just a new vocabulary forming in her mind. Document, verify, store. That week, she moved the fireproof box from the hall closet to the bottom drawer of her office filing cabinet and placed the envelope inside. The box was small, gray metal, roughly the size of a shoebox, the kind people use for passports and birth certificates and other documents that shouldn't be lost in a fire or flood. She had bought it years ago when they refinanced the house, back when interest rates dropped and they saved $130 a month on the mortgage payment, and it had sat mostly empty ever since, holding only their marriage license, their birth certificates, the deed to the house, and a few old tax forms. Now it held something else. Evidence. Proof. A starting point. She placed the envelope in the box carefully, making sure it lay flat, and closed the lid. The lock clicked with a small, satisfying sound. She placed the key on her keyring, next to her car key and office key, and went to make dinner. Over the next week, Marian began to notice things she'd either missed before or hadn't thought to question. Small details that had always been there but now carried different weight, different meaning. Daniel's schedule, for instance. He'd always worked irregular hours, construction required flexibility, meetings ran late, job sites had emergencies, but now Marian started tracking the pattern. She kept a small spiral notebook in her desk drawer and wrote down every time he said he'd be late, every excuse, every variation. Tuesday, late finish on the Riverside project, back by 9. Wednesday, supplier meeting, then paperwork, back by 10. Thursday, inspection ran over, grabbing dinner out, back by 11. Friday, drinks with the crew, celebrating the Miller job, back around midnight. She wrote them all down, word for word, with timestamps. By the end of the week, she had 5 entries, and a pattern was beginning to emerge. Thursday appeared twice. Late meetings appeared 3 times. She didn't know yet what it meant, but she knew it meant something. She also began paying closer attention to money. This was easier because money was her domain. She'd always managed the household finances. Daniel had no interest in spreadsheets or budgets or tax forms, and she had access to all their accounts: checking, savings, credit cards, the mortgage, the utilities. Every Sunday evening, she reviewed the week's transactions, categorizing expenses, checking for errors, making sure nothing was out of place. Now she looked more carefully. She pulled up the credit card statements for the last 6 months and scanned them line by line, not just glancing at the totals, but reading each merchant name, each location, each date and time. Most of it was predictable: grocery stores, gas stations, the hardware store Daniel frequented, the coffee shop near his office, restaurants they'd been to together. But scattered through the months were charges she didn't recognize. Small amounts, mostly $20 here, $35 there, from merchants with generic names that told her nothing. ATM withdrawals at odd hours. A charge for $208 at a place called Emerald Services. Another for $192 at a business called Sapphire Hospitality. She wrote them all down, created a spreadsheet, and started tracking. By early March, Daniel started saying he had late meetings. The first time, it was a Tuesday evening. He called from his truck at 6:15, his voice slightly muffled by the Bluetooth connection, and said he'd gotten pulled into a project review and would be back by 11. Marian was washing dishes when the call came through, her hands in soapy water, and she simply said okay and hung up. She made a note in her planner under the date: late meeting, 11 p.m., project review. She finished the dishes, dried her hands, and sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. He came home at 11:22. She heard his truck in the driveway, the sound of his keys in the door, his footsteps in the hallway. He came into the kitchen, loosened his tie, and poured himself a glass of water. He said the meeting had been tedious, that the clients kept changing their minds, that he was exhausted. Marian nodded and said she'd saved him some dinner if he wanted to heat it up. He said he'd eaten already, grabbed a sandwich from the gas station. He went upstairs, showered, and was asleep by midnight. The second time was a Wednesday, less than a week later. Same call, same time, different excuse. Supply chain issue, needed to meet with the distributor, back by 10:30. Marian said okay and made another note. He came home at 11:03. The third time was a Thursday. This time he didn't call until almost 7, and his voice sounded different, slightly tense, as if he was annoyed at having to report in. Client dinner, he said, one of the big remodel projects, needed to go over the budget, probably back by midnight. Marian said okay, hung up, and sat at the kitchen table for a long moment, staring at the planner. 3 late nights in 2 weeks. One of them is Thursday, the same day of the week as the receipt. She closed the planner, picked up her car keys, and drove to the address printed on the receipt. The building was on the east side of town, in a commercial district that mixed office buildings with light industrial warehouses and a few retail shops. The address took her to a narrow brick building, 3 stories tall, tucked between a dry cleaner and a shuttered furniture store. It had mirrored windows on the 2nd and 3rd floors, reflecting the streetlights and the passing traffic, and a discreet side door painted matte black with a brass handle. A valet sign stood near the curb, small and professional, the kind you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. The building had no obvious signage, just a brass plaque next to the door with an address number. Marian drove past slowly, her hands steady on the wheel, and circled the block. On the second pass, she saw a woman standing near the side door, partially hidden by a dumpster, wearing a quilted jacket and smoking a cigarette. The woman looked up as Marian's car passed, her eyes tracking the movement, and for a brief moment their gazes met. Marian felt something tighten in her chest, a mix of fear and recognition, though she couldn't have said what exactly she recognized. She drove 3 more blocks, turned into a pharmacy parking lot, and sat with her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, listening to the fan in the dashboard blow warm air into the car. She stayed there for 5 minutes, maybe longer, watching the seconds tick by on the dashboard clock, and then drove home. Daniel was already in bed when she arrived, reading a paperback western with the lamp on. He looked up when she came in, his reading glasses halfway down his nose, and asked if she'd been out. "Library," she said, hanging her coat in the closet. "Returned some books." He nodded and went back to his page, and Marian went to the bathroom, washed her face, brushed her teeth, and climbed into bed. She lay there in the dark, listening to Daniel's breathing slow and deepen as he fell asleep, and stared at the ceiling. She didn't sleep for a long time. By the middle of March, Marian had begun to change small things in her own routine, adjustments that would give her more control, more access, more information. She changed the passwords on all the accounts she managed, using a password manager and creating new, complex strings of characters that Daniel wouldn't be able to guess. She added 2-factor authentication to the iCloud account, the one that backed up both their phones and stored shared photos and documents. She set it so that any new device trying to log in would require her approval, a code sent to her phone. She told Daniel it was a security measure, something the clinic's IT consultant had recommended after a phishing attempt, and he nodded absently and said that was probably smart. He'd never been interested in technology, had never logged into iCloud or checked the settings, and Marian knew he wouldn't start now. She also adjusted her work schedule. She spoke with the office manager at the clinic, a woman named Sharon who'd been there for 20 years and ran the front desk with quiet efficiency, and asked if she could take the Tuesday morning shift instead of the Thursday afternoon shift. Sharon asked if everything was okay, and Marian said it was fine, just some personal appointments she needed to schedule. Sharon made the change without further questions. The shift swap meant Marian now worked 7 to 3 on Tuesdays and could leave early on Thursdays without anyone asking why. The extra flexibility gave her more time to observe, to track, to document. She reintroduced a habit she'd let go years earlier, recording mileage and time whenever she got in the car. She kept an index card clipped to the sun visor, the kind with lines for writing, and noted every trip she made, every mile she drove, every timestamp. Date, time, starting location, ending location, purpose, mileage. It was tedious, but Marian had learned long ago that tedious work was often the most important. Patterns emerged from data, and data required discipline. Daniel noticed the index card once, when he borrowed her car to pick up lumber, and asked if she was tracking something for taxes. She said yes, mileage deductions, something the accountant had suggested. He believed her and didn't ask again. She also started paying more attention to Daniel's physical appearance, the small changes that might have seemed insignificant on their own but added up to a picture. He'd changed cologne. The old one had been woody, cedar and sandalwood, something he'd used since she met him 30 years ago. She'd bought him a bottle every Christmas, the same brand, and he'd worn it so consistently that she associated the smell with him, the way certain songs become inseparable from certain memories. But sometime in February, he'd switched to something else. Sharper. Citrus and leather, with an undertone of spice. She noticed it one morning when he leaned over to kiss her goodbye before leaving for work, the scent different enough to make her pause. She didn't comment on it, just filed it away, another piece of information. He also started carrying cash, folding bills into his wallet in a way he hadn't done since they switched to a budgeting app 10 years earlier. They'd gone almost entirely cashless, using the credit card for everything, tracking expenses digitally, rarely keeping more than $20 or $30 in cash for emergencies. But now, every Sunday after church, Daniel stopped at the ATM and withdrew $500 in 20s. Marian knew because she checked the bank records every Sunday evening and saw the withdrawals. $500. Every week. $2,000 a month, cash that didn't appear in any other ledger, that couldn't be tracked or categorized or explained. She saw the bills once, by accident, when Daniel left his wallet on the bathroom counter while he showered. She didn't touch it, just looked, counted silently, and walked away. 10 20s, folded in half, tucked behind his driver's license. At dinner, Daniel began insisting on leading grace, something he'd always done but now with a different intensity. His prayers grew longer each week, his voice taking on a practiced rhythm, the cadence of a man used to speaking in front of people. He talked about the narrow way, about temptation, about men who lost their families because they didn't guard their hearts. He prayed for strength, for wisdom, for the courage to resist the world's distractions. Marian sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, her head bowed, and listened to every word. She wondered if he was praying for himself, if the words were a kind of preemptive defense, a way of framing his behavior as struggle rather than choice. Or maybe he didn't see it that way at all. Maybe he believed his own performance so completely that the distinction between public righteousness and private behavior had collapsed entirely. He also started saying things like, "Sweetheart, you know I'm trying." He said it after long silences, after dinners where they ate without speaking, after evenings when they sat in the living room reading or watching television without exchanging more than a few words. "You know I'm trying," he'd say, as if Marian had accused him of something, as if she'd expressed dissatisfaction or disappointment. But she hadn't. She hadn't said anything. She just went about her days, steady and quiet, doing what she'd always done. His defensiveness told her something, though. Guilt, maybe. Or awareness. Some part of him knew. His phone became a guarded object. For years, it had lived on his nightstand, charging overnight, the screen lighting up occasionally with texts or emails that he'd check in the morning. Now it moved to his pants pocket before bed. He carried it with him to the bathroom, left it face down on the kitchen counter while he made coffee, and took it everywhere he went. If Marian came into the room while he was looking at it, he'd lock the screen immediately, a quick press of the side button, and set it down as if he'd just finished whatever he was doing. The gesture was reflexive, automatic, and it told Marian more than any text message could have. Whatever was on that phone, he didn't want her to see. He also started using new phrases at dinner, describing his work in language that didn't quite fit. Network client. After-hours fellowship. Partnership development. Strategic alignment. Marian had spent enough years doing payroll and managing accounts to recognize corporate jargon when she heard it, but Daniel's company was small, personal, built on relationships and referrals. He didn't have network clients. He had homeowners who wanted their kitchens updated or their basements finished. He didn't have an after-hours fellowship. He had crew meetings at job sites and occasional drinks with his employees after a project wrapped. The words didn't belong to his work, which meant they belonged to something else. Marian didn't challenge him. She just wrote the phrases down in her notebook, dated each entry, and continued making dinner. In April, Daniel spoke during Sunday school about steadiness in a storm. The class met in a classroom on the second floor of the church, a room with folding tables and stacking chairs and a whiteboard on the wall. 15 to 20 people attended each week, mostly couples in their 40s and 50s, longtime members of the congregation who knew each other well. Daniel stood at the front of the room, his hands resting on the small wooden lectern they used for lessons, and talked about how faith required consistency, about how a man's word was his bond, about how integrity wasn't something you performed in public, but something you lived in private. He quoted scripture, told stories about biblical figures who'd been tested and remained faithful, and ended with a prayer about strength and perseverance. The class nodded along, said amen, and gathered their Bibles and notebooks to leave. Marian sat in the back row, her purse in her lap, her coat still buttoned because the room was always cold. She'd taken notes during the lesson, the same way she always did, writing down the scripture references and a few key points, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about the word integrity, about what it meant to say one thing and do another, about the distance between public performance and private choice. As people filed out, a woman sitting 2 seats over, a woman Marian had seen at services for years, but never spoken to beyond brief greetings, passed her a peppermint wrapped in cellophane and squeezed her hand. The gesture was brief, barely a second, but the pressure of the woman's fingers felt deliberate. Marian looked up, met the woman's eyes, and saw something there, sympathy, maybe, or recognition. The woman didn't say anything, just nodded slightly and left. Marian unwrapped the peppermint slowly, placed it in her mouth, and sat there for a moment longer, trying to understand what the squeeze had meant. Was it kindness? Solidarity? A warning? Did the woman know something? Or had she simply sensed that Marian needed a small gesture of connection, a reminder that she wasn't invisible? Marian didn't know, but she filed the moment away, another piece of data in a growing collection. That night, after Daniel had gone to bed, Marian sat at her desk and opened a new document on her laptop. She titled it simply, Timeline. She began listing every date she could remember, every detail that seemed relevant, working backward from the present to the first receipt in February. February 11, receipt found, $347, room/champagne/private dance. February 13, cologne change noticed. February 22, first late meeting, project review excuse. March 2nd, late meeting, supply chain excuse. March 9th, late meeting, client dinner excuse, returned 11:03. March 10th, drove past the building, observed the side entrance and valet service. She worked methodically, cross-referencing her planner and her notebook and her memory, adding times where she knew them, noting gaps where she didn't. By midnight, she had filled 3 pages, single-spaced, Times New Roman 12-point font. The document was dense with information, but it was also clear, organized, searchable. She saved it with a neutral name, budget_notes_spring, and closed the laptop. She didn't feel angry. She didn't feel sad. She felt something closer to relief. The story was writing itself. She was just the one taking dictation, making sure the facts were recorded accurately, making sure nothing was lost. In late April, Marian received an unexpected call at work. It was mid-afternoon, during the lull between the lunch appointments and the evening rush, and she was at her desk reviewing insurance claims when her cell phone rang. The number was local but unfamiliar. She almost didn't answer, assuming it was spam or a wrong number, but something made her pick up. Hello. Is this Marian Holt? The voice was female, older, and careful. Yes. My name is Linda Morris. I'm calling because, well, I'm not sure how to say this, so I'll just say it directly. I think our husbands might be going to the same place. Marian felt her pulse quicken, but kept her voice steady. What place? A club. East Side. I found a receipt in my husband's jacket. I followed him last Thursday. I saw him go in. And then I saw your husband. There was a long silence. Marian could hear the woman breathing, could hear the strain in her voice, the effort it took to make this call. How did you get my number? Marian asked. I hired someone. A private investigator. He tracked license plates. Got names. I'm sorry. I know this is strange. But I thought you should know. Thank you, Marian said quietly. What are you going to do? Linda asked. I don't know yet. I filed last week, Linda said. 26 years. I filed last week. Her voice cracked slightly on the last words. I'm sorry, Marian said, and she meant it. Me too. The woman hung up. Marian sat at her desk, phone still in her hand, and stared at the wall. Another wife. Another timeline running parallel to hers. Another woman discovering the same truth, making the same calculations, deciding how to respond. Marian saved the number in her phone, labeled it simply Linda, and returned to the insurance claims. But her hands were shaking slightly, and it took her 3 tries to enter the correct billing code. By May, everything became concrete. It was a Tuesday evening, just after 7 o'clock, and Marian was at the family laptop in the dining room, exporting budget spreadsheets for the clinic's quarterly review. The laptop was old, a 5-year-old Dell that ran slowly and took forever to start up, but it was sufficient for household tasks, paying bills, checking bank statements, ordering groceries online, printing recipes. Daniel rarely used it. He preferred his phone for everything, but his email was still synced to the Mail app, a configuration they'd set up years ago so they could both access shared accounts and utility statements. Marian didn't monitor his email actively. There was no reason to, and doing so felt invasive in a way she hadn't yet been willing to cross. But while she waited for the export to finish, sitting at the table with a cup of tea growing cold beside her, an email notification pinged in the corner of the screen. New message. The preview showed a sender name she recognized immediately, the same merchant from the first receipt. The subject line read, "Your recent visit, receipt enclosed." Marian felt her heartbeat in her throat. She moved the cursor to the notification, hesitated for half a second, then clicked. The email opened in a new window. It was professional, templated, the kind of automated message businesses send after transactions. "Thank you for your patronage. We hope you enjoyed your experience. Please see your receipt attached." She opened the attachment. A PDF receipt, detailed and itemized, dated May 9th. 4 days earlier. The charges were higher this time. VIP room package, $435. Courtesy shuttle service, $50. Gratuity, $107. Total, $592. Charged to the joint credit card ending in 7421. Marian stared at the screen, her eyes moving over the numbers, the dates, the descriptions. Then she took 3 screenshots, one of the email, one of the receipt, one of the email headers showing the date and time received. She saved them to a folder labeled household_records, a folder that already contained dozens of files related to utilities, taxes, and mortgage documents. Then she opened the PDF attachment again and saved it with a neutral file name, utility_statement_May_09. She sent the file to the printer in the corner, a small HP inkjet that wheezed to life, and produced 2 copies, front and back. She paper-clipped them together, then retrieved the original receipt from the fireproof box in her office and clipped all 3 documents together. She placed them back in the manila envelope and returned it to the box. That evening, while the printer was still warm, Marian sat at the laptop and did something she'd been avoiding. She logged into the credit card account and pulled up the full transaction history for the last 6 months. She exported it to Excel, opened the file, and began sorting by merchant name. The same merchants appeared again and again, the ones with generic names that meant nothing: Emerald Services, Sapphire Hospitality, Diamond Consulting, Platinum Entertainment. She Googled each one. Most had no website, no business listing, just addresses that matched commercial districts on the east side of town. A few had minimal online presences, single-page sites with vague descriptions like hospitality services and private events. One had a Yelp page with reviews that were clearly written in code, great atmosphere, discreet and professional. Worth every penny. She copied the URLs, pasted them into a document, and saved it. Then she clicked through to the card processor and logged into the detailed transaction portal, the one that showed not just the amounts and dates, but also the authorization codes, the timestamps, the GPS coordinates of where the card was swiped. She downloaded 6 months of data, opened it in Excel, and began cross-referencing. For visits in March alone. 3 in April. 2 so far in May, including the one from 4 days ago. All on Thursday evenings between 8 p.m. and midnight. All at locations within a 3-mile radius of the building she'd driven past. She calculated the total. Over $3,000 in 4 months. 12 visits, possibly more if he'd used cash. She saved the spreadsheet, backed it up to her personal cloud account, and printed 2 copies. She added them to the envelope. That night, Daniel read a Bible passage about self-control at the dinner table. He'd started doing this occasionally, a new habit that had emerged in April, reading a verse before grace, his voice calm and measured, as if the ritual itself could sanctify the meal. Tonight's passage was from 1 Corinthians, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others I myself should be disqualified. He read it slowly, his finger tracing the words on the page, then closed the Bible and bowed his head for grace. He thanked God for the food, for the house, for their health, for the opportunity to serve. Then he said grace again, under his breath, a whispered repetition that Marian could barely hear. She set his plate in front of him, chicken breast, roasted vegetables, a small serving of rice, and poured water into his glass. They ate in silence, the only sound the scrape of forks on ceramic and the distant hum of traffic outside. After dinner, Daniel said he had a client meeting and would be back late. He didn't specify the client, didn't offer details, just said client meeting as if the phrase itself was sufficient explanation. Marian nodded, cleared the table, and waited until she heard his truck pull out of the driveway, the diesel engine fading into the distance. Then she got her car keys, her phone, and her planner and drove to the lounge. This time she was more deliberate. She didn't park across the street or down the block. She found a spot in a public parking garage 2 blocks away, paid for 2 hours, and walked back to the building. She wore a dark coat, jeans, flat shoes, clothes that wouldn't draw attention. She carried a small notebook and a pen. It was 8:37 p.m. according to her phone. The street was busy enough that she didn't stand out, people coming and going from restaurants, a few smokers outside a bar, a couple walking a dog. She stood near a bus stop across the street from the lounge, partially shielded by a transit shelter, and waited. At 8:52, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. Tinted windows, expensive rims, a discreet logo on the door that Marian couldn't quite read. The valet approached, opened the rear passenger door, and Daniel stepped out. He was wearing a suit, navy blue, with a light blue shirt and no tie. He'd showered before leaving, she realized. His hair was damp, combed back. He adjusted his jacket, checked his reflection in the SUV's tinted window, and smoothed his hair with one hand. The gesture was careful, vain, the gesture of a man preparing to be seen. He walked through the side door without hesitation, confident, familiar, and disappeared into the building. Marian wrote down the time, the license plate of the SUV, the valet company name visible on the sign, and the description of Daniel's clothing. She stayed for 20 more minutes, watching the entrance, watching other men arrive, some alone, some in pairs, all dressed well, all moving with the same confidence. Then she walked back to the parking garage, drove to a 24-hour convenience store, and bought the coffee Daniel liked, the expensive kind in the glass bottle, and a bag of lemons because their tree had stopped producing. She drove home, set the items on the counter, and wrote in her planner, not a mistake. A routine. Over the following weeks, Marian expanded her surveillance. She didn't follow Daniel every time he left the house. That would be obvious, detectable, but she tracked enough to confirm the pattern. Every Thursday. Sometimes Tuesdays. Occasionally a Saturday, though less frequently. She varied her approach, sometimes parking nearby, sometimes walking past, sometimes just driving by at the time he said he'd be out and noting whether his truck was at home or gone. She took photos when she could, discreet shots on her phone that captured timestamps and locations, but nothing compromising. She wasn't trying to catch him in the act. She was trying to build a chain of custody, a documented timeline that would be defensible in court. She also began preparing financially. She opened a new bank account at a different institution, a credit union across town that offered free checking and no monthly fees. She went in person, sat down with a representative, and explained that she needed an account in her name only, separate from her husband, for personal savings. The representative didn't ask questions, just handed her the forms. Marian filled them out, provided her driver's license and social security card, and signed. The account was active within 48 hours. She requested a debit card, set up online access, and began transferring money. Not large amounts that would trigger alerts, questions, but steady amounts. $150 from each paycheck, routed automatically through direct deposit. By the end of June, she'd saved nearly $1,000. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A foundation. She also began gathering documents. Over the course of several weeks, she made copies of everything that mattered, tax returns for the last 10 years, the mortgage documents, the deed to the house, the titles to both vehicles, insurance policies, retirement account statements, bank statements going back 3 years. She kept the originals in their usual places, the filing cabinet in the office, the safe in the closet, and stored the copies in a folder she kept at work, locked in her desk drawer. She also created a second set of digital backups, saving everything to a USB drive that she kept in her purse, and a third set in a cloud account she'd created for this purpose, separate from their shared iCloud, with a unique password Daniel would never guess. She photographed valuables room by room, creating a visual inventory. Daniel's possessions: the watch his father had given him before he died, a gold Seiko with an inscription on the back. The signed baseball on the shelf in his office, a gift from a client who'd gotten it at a charity auction. The tool set he kept in the garage, Craftsman wrenches and sockets polished to a shine, organized in a red rolling cabinet. Her own possessions: the quilt her mother had made, hand-stitched squares in blue and white, folded at the foot of the guest bed. The sapphire ring she'd inherited from her grandmother, a small stone set in silver, nothing expensive but irreplaceable. The recipe card in her grandmother's handwriting for lemon cake, faded and stained but legible, tucked into a cookbook she never used but couldn't discard. She photographed it all, labeled each file with a description and date, and stored them with the other backups. By summer, Marian had assembled what could only be described as a case file. It wasn't organized for presentation yet, but the raw materials were there: receipts, bank statements, credit card records, screenshots, photographs, timelines, spreadsheets. Everything dated, everything labeled, everything cross-referenced. She kept it all in the fireproof box, which had grown heavier with each edition, and in the digital backups, which she updated weekly. She wasn't sure yet what she would do with it, but she knew that in any dispute, legal, financial, or moral, documentation was power. Whoever controlled the narrative controlled the outcome. And Marian was determined to control the narrative. In early July, she received another call from Linda Morris, the woman who'd contacted her in April. "I wanted you to know," Linda said, her voice steadier than the first time they'd spoken. "The divorce is final." "It took 3 months. He didn't contest. I think he knew I had enough." "Congratulations," Marian said, though the word felt strange. "Are you still thinking about it?" Linda asked. "Yes. If you need the name of my lawyer, I can give it to you. She's good. Direct." Marian wrote down the name and number, thanked her, and hung up. That evening, she sat in her office and looked at the business card Rosa Delaney had given her months ago, the one for a family lawyer named L. Warren. She set it on the desk next to the name Linda had provided, compared the two, and decided to go with Rosa's recommendation. Rosa was practical, unsentimental, and Marian trusted her judgment. She called the number the next morning from her car during her lunch break and made an appointment. The earliest available slot was 3 weeks away, mid-August. Marian took it. In mid-July, Marian and Daniel attended a church barbecue, an annual summer event held in the parking lot behind the building. Long tables covered with red and white checkered cloths, grills smoking hamburgers and hot dogs, folding chairs arranged in clusters, children running between the tables with popsicles and toy swords. Daniel worked the grill with 2 other men from the building committee, flipping patties and joking about who made the best burgers. Marian sat at a table with a group of women she knew vaguely, making small talk about the heat, about vacation plans, about recipes. She was good at small talk, at saying just enough to be polite without revealing anything significant. After an hour, she excused herself to use the restroom, walked inside the building, and found herself standing in the empty hallway, staring at a bulletin board covered with announcements, upcoming mission trips, volunteer opportunities, Bible study schedules. And there, in the corner, a flyer for the annual couples retreat. October 15th through 17th. A weekend at a lodge 2 hours north of Columbus. Registration is open now. She pulled out her phone and took a picture of the flyer. Then she went back outside, finished her burger, and helped clean up. That night, she mentioned the retreat to Daniel. "Saw the flyer at church," she said casually. The couple's retreat in October. He looked up from his phone, his expression neutral. Yeah? You want to go? Maybe, she said. Could be good. He nodded slowly, as if considering. I'll think about it. 2 days later, he brought home a registration form, filled out and ready to mail. I think we should go, he said. Good for us. Marian looked at the form, at the dates, and felt something click into place. October 15th. That gave her 3 months. 3 months to finish gathering evidence, to consult with the lawyer, to prepare. 3 months before the retreat, which would give her a fixed date, a deadline, a moment when everything would come together. Okay, she said. Let's do it. He smiled, relieved, and mailed the form that afternoon. In early August, Marian met with attorney L. Warren. The office was in a low-brick building near the university, professional but not ostentatious, the kind of place that handled family law, estate planning, and small business contracts. The waiting room had 3 chairs, a coffee table with outdated magazines, and a receptionist behind a glass window who took Marian's name and asked her to wait. 10 minutes later, a door opened and a woman emerged. Attorney Warren was 60 years old, gray-haired, dressed in a navy suit with minimal jewelry. She shook Marian's hand firmly and led her to a conference room with a long wooden table, a whiteboard on one wall, and a slow ceiling fan that turned in lazy circles above them. The room smelled like old paper and lemon furniture polish. Tell me why you're here, Attorney Warren said, sitting down and folding her hands on the table. Marian opened her bag and pulled out the manila envelope. She slid it across the table. Attorney Warren opened it, pulled out the contents, and began reviewing receipts, screenshots, bank statements, the timeline document Marian had created. She flipped through each item methodically, her expression neutral, professional, betraying nothing. After several minutes, she looked up. How long have you known? February, Marian said. Found the first receipt in February. And you've been documenting since then? Yes. Attorney Warren nodded and returned to the materials. She made a few notes on a legal pad, asked questions about the dates, about the accounts, about Daniel's behavior and his statements. She asked if there were any children. Marian said no. She asked about assets, the house, the cars, retirement accounts, savings. Marian listed them, provided approximate values. Attorney Warren wrote everything down, her handwriting small and precise. You've done my work for me, she said finally, not unkindly. This is excellent documentation. Clear, organized, defensible. What happens now? Marian asked. That depends on what you want. If you want to file for divorce, we can do that. I'll need to prepare a petition, file it with the court, and serve him. He'll have the opportunity to respond. Most likely, he'll deny the allegations, at least initially. He may try to negotiate, to settle without going to court. If he's smart, he'll do that. If not, we'll proceed to discovery, depositions, trial if necessary. But given the documentation you have, I'd be surprised if it went that far. How long does it take? 4 to 6 months if he doesn't contest. Longer if he does. Ohio requires a 90-day waiting period after filing, and then there's scheduling, paperwork, negotiations. But you're well positioned. You have documentation, you have a clear timeline, and if he's been using joint funds for personal expenses, that works in your favor for asset division. Marian nodded, processing the information. He teaches Sunday school, she said. At our church. I'm not sure how to handle that. Attorney Warren leaned back in her chair. Do you want to alert the church leadership? I think so. But I don't know how. If you do, keep it factual. No commentary. No emotion. Just the facts and why they're relevant. Let them make their own determination. Don't try to control the outcome. Just provide the information and step back. Will that hurt me legally? Not if you do it right. If you start making accusations, if you publicly shame him, if you violate any confidentiality agreements, that could be a problem. But if you simply inform the appropriate people of relevant facts that concern the safety or integrity of the organization, that's protected. Just be careful. Document everything. Keep copies of everything you send. Marian nodded again. When do you want to file? Attorney Warren asked. Not yet, Marian said. There's a couple's retreat in October. Mid-October. I think that's the right time. Attorney Warren studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right. That gives us 2 months to prepare. I'll draft the petition, get everything ready to file. When you give me the word, we'll move. In the meantime, keep documenting. Don't change your behavior. Don't confront him. Just continue as you have been. What about the church? That's your call. If you want to send something to the leadership, I can help you draft it. Or you can do it yourself. Just remember, facts only. No adjectives. No accusations. Just information and relevance. They talked for another 30 minutes, going over procedural details, costs, timelines. Attorney Warren explained the retainer, the hourly rate, the likely total cost. Marian agreed to the terms, wrote a check for the retainer, and shook Attorney Warren's hand. As she stood to leave, Attorney Warren handed her 2 empty manila envelopes. One for me, she said. One for whoever needs to know. Marian took them, thanked her, and left. On the drive home, she felt something she hadn't felt in months: certainty. The plan was taking shape. The pieces were moving into place. She just had to stay steady, stay quiet, and wait for the right moment. Over the next few weeks, Marian prepared 2 more packets. One was for Attorney Warren, a duplicate of everything she'd already provided, updated with July and August transactions. She mailed it in late August with a cover note, ready to proceed as discussed. File on October 16th. The other packet was for the church. This one took longer to assemble because Marian wanted to be precise, factual, unemotional. She included copies of 3 receipts, spaced over several months, to show a pattern rather than isolated incident. She included a simple timeline document, just dates and amounts, no commentary. And she wrote a cover letter, 1 page, in her careful handwriting. To the Board of Elders, I am writing to inform you of matters that concern the public integrity of a person who teaches children in our congregation. Enclosed are documented expenses from commercial establishments that provide adult entertainment services. These expenses were charged to joint accounts and occurred regularly over several months. I am providing this information because I believe the board should be aware when someone in a teaching role may not be upholding the standards expected of them. I am not asking for any specific action. I am simply providing facts that I believe are relevant to your oversight responsibilities. If you have questions, you may contact me at the number below. Marian Holt. She read it 3 times, checking for tone, for accuracy, for anything that could be misinterpreted as vindictive or emotional. It was clean, neutral, just information and relevance, exactly as Attorney Warren had advised. She sealed the envelope, addressed it to Evelyn Brooks, the board chair, and placed it in the fireproof box. She didn't mail it yet. She would wait until October, until the week before the retreat, so that the timing would align with the legal filing. By September, Daniel had started talking about the retreat with genuine enthusiasm. He mentioned it over breakfast, said it would be good for them, that they needed time away from routines, from distractions, from the pressures of work and church responsibilities. He talked about the lodge, about the activities, hiking, bonfires, group discussions, worship sessions, and said he was looking forward to reconnecting. Marian listened, nodded, and said she was looking forward to it too. She wasn't lying. She was looking forward to it, but not for the reasons Daniel imagined. She was looking forward to it because it was the deadline, the moment when everything would converge, when the months of documentation and preparation would culminate in action. She was looking forward to it the way you look forward to the end of a long, difficult project, with relief and anticipation and the quiet knowledge that the hard part was almost over. In mid-September, she took a personal day from work and drove to the bank. She asked to speak with the branch manager, Carl, a man in his 50s who'd managed the Columbus branch for over a decade. Marian had worked with him for years, depositing clinic funds, managing the clinic's payroll account, and he knew her as reliable, professional, someone who didn't waste his time. "Carl, I need something," she said, sitting down in his office. "Sure, Marian. What can I do for you?" "I need printed statements for the last 18 months. Both the joint checking and the joint credit card." He raised his eyebrows slightly. That's a lot of paper. Everything okay? Just organizing files, she said. Personal records. He nodded, didn't press further, and spent the next 20 minutes generating the reports. He printed them, collated them, and handed them over in a thick manila folder. Marian thanked him, took the folder, and left. In her car, she flipped through the pages, over 200 sheets, both sides printed, every transaction recorded in small, precise type. She drove home, spread the statements on her dining table, and began the process of sorting. She organized them by month, matched them with the receipts and screenshots she'd already collected, and stapled each set together. By the time she finished, it was nearly midnight. The dining table was covered with neat stacks of paper, each one representing a month, each one documenting a pattern of behavior that was now undeniable. She also found something new in the statements, something she'd missed before, a recurring monthly charge of $67 to a business called Secure Space Storage. The charge had started in March and appeared every month since, always on the first of the month. Marian Googled the business, found an address, a storage facility on the east side of town, not far from the lounge, and wrote it down. She didn't know what was in the storage unit, but she knew it was relevant. Another piece of the puzzle. The next morning, a Saturday, Marian drove to the storage facility while Daniel was at a building committee meeting. The facility was a grid of orange metal units behind a chain-link fence, the kind of place where people stored furniture, seasonal decorations, and business inventory. There was a gate at the entrance, locked, accessible only with a code. Marian drove past slowly, noted the unit number from the account statement, Unit 217, and took several photos through the fence, the unit door, the lock, the surrounding area. She didn't try to enter. She didn't need to. She just needed to document that it existed, that it was being paid for with joint funds, and that Daniel had never mentioned it. That was enough. In early October, 2 weeks before the retreat, Marian made her final preparations. She reviewed every document, every file, every piece of evidence she'd collected over the last 8 months. She organized them into 3 separate packets: legal, church, and personal archive. The legal packet went to Attorney Warren, priority mail, with delivery confirmation. The church packet she held onto, planning to mail it on Wednesday, October 13th, 2 days before the retreat. The personal archive stayed in the fireproof box, a complete set of duplicates in case anything was ever challenged or questioned. She also handled the financial transfer. On Friday, October 8th, during her lunch break, Marian logged into their joint savings account and transferred $11,300 into her separate account at the credit union. The amount was exact, documented to the penny, because it represented the inheritance she'd received from her grandmother 8 years earlier. She had the probate paperwork, the original deposit receipt, and a letter from the estate attorney confirming the amount. The transfer was clean, legal, and defensible. It wasn't half of the savings, that would come later, through the settlement, but it was her money, probably hers, and she was moving it to protect it. She printed the confirmation, saved a PDF, and wrote a note on plain white paper, documented transfer of inheritance funds per legal counsel. Itemized list attached. See enclosed probate documents for verification. She dated it, signed it, and placed it in the safe at home, the small fireproof safe they kept in the master bedroom closet. The note wasn't for Daniel. It was for the legal record, for Attorney Warren, for anyone who might question her actions later. She was building a chain of custody for every decision she made, making sure nothing could be challenged as impulsive or vindictive. That evening, Daniel came home in a good mood. He'd finished a big remodel project ahead of schedule, the clients were thrilled, and he'd received a check for the final payment. He talked about it over dinner, about how satisfying it was when things came together, when the work was appreciated, when the outcome matched the vision. Marian listened, nodded, and asked appropriate questions. She'd become very good at this over the months, at being present without being engaged, at performing normalcy while her mind worked elsewhere. They finished dinner, cleaned up together, and watched television for an hour before bed. It was an ordinary evening, unremarkable, the kind they'd had 1,000 times before. Except that Marian knew it was one of the last. On Wednesday, October 13th, Marian went to the post office during her lunch break. She mailed the packet to Evelyn Brooks, certified mail, return receipt requested. She wanted proof of delivery, wanted to know exactly when it arrived and who signed for it. The clerk weighed the envelope, applied the postage, and handed Marian the receipt. She folded it carefully, placed it in her wallet, and went back to work. That evening, she didn't mention it to Daniel. They packed for the retreat casual clothes, sweaters, comfortable shoes, and went to bed early. The drive would take 2 hours, and they planned to leave Friday morning at 9. On Thursday evening, Daniel was out again. Late meeting, client follow-up, back by 10. Marian knew where he was. She didn't bother tracking him this time. She just sat at home, finished reading a book, and went to bed. When he came home at 10:47, smelling faintly of the cologne she'd come to associate with his absences, she pretended to be asleep. Friday morning arrived clear and cold, the sky bright blue, the air sharp with the coming winter. They loaded the car, locked the house, and drove north. Daniel was in a good mood, talking about the retreat schedule, about the activities, about how nice it would be to spend time away from the usual pressures. Marian watched the landscape pass, suburban sprawl giving way to farmland, then forest, the trees already turning gold and red, and felt calm. She'd done everything she could do. Now she just had to wait. The lodge was 2 hours north of Columbus, set on a small lake surrounded by woods. It was a conference center owned by a Christian organization, used primarily for church events, corporate retreats, and summer camps. The main building was stone and timber, rustic but well-maintained, with a large common room, a dining hall, and a dozen guest rooms upstairs. There were also several cabins scattered around the property, small 2-room structures with bunk beds and wood stoves. Marian and Daniel were assigned a room in the main building, second floor, overlooking the lake. They unpacked, changed into casual clothes, and went downstairs for the welcome session. The retreat had 32 participants, 16 couples, all from various churches in the Columbus area. The schedule was printed on cream-colored cardstock and placed at each seat in the common room. Friday evening welcome and worship, Saturday morning group session on communication, Saturday afternoon free time, Saturday evening testimony and reflection, Sunday morning worship and closing. Meals were communal, served in the dining hall, family style. The atmosphere was warm, friendly, slightly performative in the way church events often are, everyone smiling, everyone polite, everyone presenting their best selves. Saturday morning, after breakfast, the group session began at 9. The topic was communication in marriage, led by a pastor and his wife from a church in Dublin. They talked about active listening, about expressing needs without accusations, about the importance of honesty and vulnerability. They used worksheets, breakout discussions, and role-playing exercises. Marian participated, took notes, and said the things people expected to hear. Daniel was engaged, earnest, nodding along, occasionally squeezing Marian's hand as if to say, "See, we're doing this together." Marian squeezed back, smiled, and thought about the packet sitting in Evelyn Brooks's mailbox, about the legal petition sitting on Attorney Warren's desk, about the $11,300 sitting in her separate account. At 11, during the break, Evelyn Brooks arrived. Marian saw her through the window, walking up the path from the parking lot, wearing a gray cardigan and dark slacks, her hair pulled back in its usual neat bun. Evelyn hadn't been registered for the retreat. Marian had checked the participant list. Her presence here, now, was deliberate. Planned. Marian felt her pulse quicken, but kept her expression neutral. She poured herself coffee, added cream, and waited. Evelyn entered the common room, scanned the space, and spotted Marian and Daniel sitting at a table near the window. She approached, her face calm and professional, and nodded to Marian before addressing Daniel. "Daniel, could I speak with you outside for a moment?" Her voice was polite, neutral, the tone of someone making a routine request, but there was something underneath it, a firmness, an authority, that made it clear this wasn't optional. Daniel looked surprised but stood immediately, wiping his mouth with a napkin. Of course, Evelyn. Is everything okay? Let's talk outside. Daniel followed her out through the side door, and Marian watched through the window as they walked toward the edge of the parking lot, away from the building, away from other people. Evelyn's posture was straight, her hands clasped in front of her. Daniel's posture shifted as they talked, initially casual, then defensive, then something closer to panic. His hands moved as he spoke, gestures of explanation, of justification. Evelyn remained still, listening, her expression unchanging. The conversation lasted 45 minutes. Other people noticed, glanced toward the window, and whispered quietly. Marian stayed at the table, sipping her coffee, her face calm, her hands steady. When Daniel returned, his face was pale, his movements stiff. He sat down next to Marian, avoiding eye contact, and picked up his coffee cup with a hand that shook slightly. He took a sip, set it down, and stared at the table. What did Evelyn want? Marian asked, her voice neutral. Someone spreading lies, he said quietly. Jealous people. People who want to hurt us. Marian nodded, but didn't respond. She sipped her coffee and looked out at the lake. That afternoon, during free time, Daniel's phone rang. He stepped outside to take the call, returned 15 minutes later with a forced smile, and said they might need to leave early. Marian asked why. He said there was an issue at work, something that needed his attention. Marian nodded and said they should stay, that they'd committed to the weekend, that leaving early would be disrespectful to the organizers. Daniel hesitated, then agreed. But the smile didn't reach his eyes, and for the rest of the afternoon he was distracted, checking his phone, stepping outside for more calls, his mood shifting from tense to defensive to quietly desperate. That evening, during the testimony session, a few couples shared stories of challenges they'd faced, financial struggles, health crises, conflicts with in-laws, and how faith had sustained them. Daniel didn't volunteer. He sat next to Marian, his jaw tight, his hands clasped between his knees. When the session ended, he said he needed to present unity, that this was a test, that they needed to pass it together. Marian folded her hands in her lap, looked out at the lake through the window, and said nothing. She had already scheduled the filing for Monday morning, 9 o'clock, everything stamped and ready. What Daniel wanted didn't matter anymore. Sunday morning, they attended the closing worship session, sang hymns, listened to a sermon about renewal and restoration. Afterward, they packed their bags, loaded the car, and drove home in silence. Daniel tried once to start a conversation, asking if Marian had enjoyed the retreat, if she felt like it had been worthwhile. She said it had been fine and left it at that. He didn't press. By the time they reached Columbus, it was early afternoon. Marian unpacked, started a load of laundry, and made tea. Daniel went to his office, closed the door, and stayed there for the rest of the day. Monday morning, Marian woke early, showered, dressed for work, and left the house by 7:30. She stopped at a cafe near the clinic, ordered coffee, and checked her phone. At 9:03, she received a text from Attorney Warren, filed and served. Confirmation attached. Marian opened the attachment, a copy of the divorce petition, stamped by the court, with a service confirmation showing that Daniel had been served at his office at 8:57 a.m. Marian saved the file, forwarded it to her personal email, and drove to work. At 9:41, Daniel called. She didn't answer. He called again at 9:53. Again at 10:15. At 10:32, he left a voicemail. Marian, what the hell is this? Call me. We need to talk. She didn't call back. At 11:07, another voicemail. This is insane. You're being dramatic. We can fix this. At 1:23. You know what men face out there? This is just temptation. This is normal. Don't do this. She saved all the messages, backed them up, and returned to work. That afternoon, she received a call from Evelyn Brooks. Marian, it's Evelyn. I wanted you to know that the board met this morning. We're suspending Daniel from all teaching responsibilities, pending an internal review. It's procedural, not punitive, but we need to verify the information and assess our policies. I understand, Marian said. I also want to thank you, Evelyn continued. What you sent was clear, factual, and appropriate. It gave us what we needed to act responsibly. I know this wasn't easy. It wasn't, Marian said quietly. If you need anything, please let me know. Thank you, Evelyn. They hung up. Marian sat at her desk, hands folded, and felt something release inside her. Not joy, not satisfied. Just the quiet relief of a burden lifted, a truth told, a process begun. That evening, Marian changed the locks. She'd arranged it in advance with a locksmith, scheduled for 5:30 p.m., and the work took less than an hour. New deadbolts, new keys, the old ones discarded. She also called the utility companies, gas, electric, water, internet, and set up new accounts in her name only. She updated the passwords on every shared digital account she could access, streaming services, grocery delivery, the credit monitoring service, the email address they used for bills. She didn't do it out of anger. She did it because separation required boundaries, and boundaries required clarity. When Daniel came home at 6:45, his key didn't work. He knocked, rang the doorbell, and called Marian's phone. She answered and told him calmly that the locks had been changed, that she'd filed for divorce, and that he should find somewhere else to stay. He stood on the porch, visible through the window, his face a mix of shock and anger, and demanded she let him in. She said no and hung up. He called back 3 times. She didn't answer. After 20 minutes, he got in his truck and drove away. Marian watched from the window, her arms crossed, her face calm, and then she closed the curtains, made dinner, and ate it slowly, listening to the clock in the hallway tick through another hour. Over the next 2 weeks, Marian's life reorganized itself into a new pattern. Daniel called several times a day initially, leaving messages that ranged from pleading to angry to coldly rational. She listened to them, saved them, and didn't respond. Attorney Warren sent her copies of everything: the petition, Daniel's initial response, a denial of all allegations and a demand that the case be dismissed, the financial disclosures, the proposed temporary orders. Marian reviewed each document carefully, signed where necessary, and sent everything back. The church's internal review concluded in late October. Evelyn Brooks resigned as board chair, citing personal reasons, though Marian suspected it had more to do with the toll the situation had taken than with any actual personal crisis. A new board chair stepped in, a man named Gerald, who'd been on the board for 6 years and was known for his focus on policy and structure. One of his first actions was to convene a committee to review and update the church's oversight policies. Within a month, new requirements were in place: updated background checks for all volunteers who worked with minors, financial transparency for program leaders, a new rule requiring 2 chaperones of different genders for all overnight activities with children, and written parental consent for any off-site events. The changes were announced in a Sunday bulletin under the heading "Strengthening Our Community." Marian read the bulletin, folded it, and placed it in the fireproof box. Her packet had done more than she'd aimed for. It had forced an institution to look at itself, to acknowledge gaps in its accountability structures, to change. Daniel told mutual friends that Marian had coldly abandoned him. The story he told was vague, but designed to elicit sympathy. She'd changed. She'd become distant. She'd refused to work on the marriage. She'd filed without warning. Some people believed him. Others asked Marian directly what had happened. She gave them all the same answer, calm and brief. We're different people now. She didn't elaborate. She didn't defend herself. She didn't offer details. She let the silence do the work. Those who needed to know already knew. Those who didn't need to know didn't need her explanations. By mid-November, the settlement discussions began. Marian and Daniel met in Attorney Warren's conference room, each with their respective lawyers. The room was cold, the air conditioning running despite the late fall chill outside, and the table was covered with documents: asset lists, bank statements, retirement account summaries, appraisals for the house and vehicles. Attorney Warren started by outlining the facts: 22 years of marriage, no children, joint assets totaling approximately $337,000, including the house, 2 vehicles, retirement accounts, and savings. She presented Marian's documentation, the receipts, the bank statements, the timeline, the evidence of expenditures from joint funds for personal purposes. Daniel's lawyer, a man in his mid-40s wearing a gray suit, reviewed the materials, his face impassive. He leaned toward Daniel, spoke quietly for several minutes, then straightened. "My client disputes the characterization of these expenditures." "Noted," Attorney Warren said. "But the expenditures themselves are documented and not in dispute. They were business-related." "To what business?" Daniel's lawyer hesitated. "Networking. Client entertainment. At adult entertainment venues." Silence. Daniel's lawyer shuffled papers, looked at Daniel, then back at Attorney Warren. "We'd like time to review. You have 48 hours. The meeting ended. 2 days later, Daniel's lawyer called and proposed a settlement: the house to Marian, the retirement accounts split per Ohio's formulaic guidelines, no alimony either way. Daniel would keep the truck, the tools, and his personal belongings. Marian would keep the sedan, the household items, and the accounts already in her name. The mortgage would be refinanced in Marian's name within 90 days, or the house would be sold and proceeds divided. Attorney Warren called Marian, read her the proposal, and asked what she thought. "It's acceptable," Marian said. "No alimony either way." "You're sure?" "I don't want anything from him. I want this over." "All right. I'll draft the settlement agreement." By early December, the paperwork was signed. Marian and Daniel met one final time in Attorney Warren's conference room. Each signed the settlement agreement in the presence of their lawyers, and the documents were filed with the court. The divorce would be final in 90 days, pending the waiting period and the judge's approval. Daniel asked, as they stood to leave, if they could pray together. His voice was soft, almost gentle, as if the question itself could undo everything that had led them to this room. Marian looked at him for a long moment, this man she'd shared 2 decades of her life with, this man who'd taught Sunday school and organized charity dinners and spoken so often about integrity, and felt nothing. Not anger. Not sadness. Just nothing. "No," she said, not unkindly. She gathered her papers, thanked Attorney Warren, and left. Daniel moved into an apartment near the Ring Road, a 2-bedroom unit in a complex with a pool and a fitness center he would never use. Over the following weeks, he came by the house a few times to collect his belongings: clothes, books, tools, the television, a few pieces of furniture. Marian let him in, supervised from a distance, and locked the door behind him when he left. She didn't make small talk. She didn't ask how he was doing. She just facilitated the practical necessities and moved on. By Christmas, Marian had begun to settle into her new life. She worked her regular schedule at the clinic, attended church occasionally, though she sat in the back and left before coffee, and spent her evenings reading, organizing the house, and slowly redecorating. She repainted the living room a soft gray, a color she'd always preferred but Daniel had dismissed as too cold. She moved the mantel clock to the hallway, where its ticking was softer, less intrusive. She sold the heavy dining set Daniel had loved, a dark wood table with 8 matching chairs that took up too much space, and bought a smaller one with clean lines and a light finish. It seated 4, which was more than she needed, but it felt right. Proportional. Hers. Winter came early that year. By mid-December, Columbus was covered in snow, and the streets were lined with ice that didn't melt until February. Marian bundled up, drove carefully, and kept her routine. On New Year's Eve, she stayed home, made soup, watched an old movie, and went to bed at 10:30. She didn't feel like she was missing anything. The next morning, she woke early, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with her planner. She wrote out her goals for the year: pay off the car within 6 months, pay off the mortgage within 7 years, increase her volunteer hours at the shelter, finish the stack of books on her nightstand, take a vacation, something simple, maybe a week at the coast. She also wrote one line at the bottom of the page, a reminder she wanted to carry forward: stay honest. Stay still. By February, 1 full year after the receipt had fallen from the Bible, Marian had paid off the sedan. She'd made extra payments each month, small amounts that added up, and the final payment cleared on a Tuesday morning. She printed the payoff statement, filed it with the car title, and felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with autonomy. She was building a life that was entirely hers, a life not dependent on anyone else's choices or failures, a life she could sustain and control. In March, she planted tomatoes again. This time she added peppers, basil, cilantro, expanding the raised bed she'd built the previous year. She worked in the evenings after work, her hands in the soil, the air cool and damp with early spring. A neighbor, Helen, an older woman who lived 3 houses down, stopped by one evening and admired the garden. They talked about planting schedules, about compost, about the best varieties for the Ohio climate. Helen mentioned she'd been thinking about starting her own garden, but wasn't sure where to begin. Marian offered to help. The following Saturday, they spent the afternoon building a small raised bed in Helen's backyard. It was simple work, companionable, and when they finished, Helen made lemonade and they sat on the porch, tired and satisfied. It was the first friendship Marian had formed in years that felt entirely her own, uncomplicated by church or marriage or shared history. By late March, the divorce was final. Marian received the decree in the mail, a single sheet of paper with the court seal and the judge's signature. She read it once, filed it in the fireproof box, and went on with her day. It was over. 22 years, reduced to a legal document, a stack of papers, a series of signatures. She didn't cry. She didn't celebrate. She just accepted it as a fact, the way you accept that winter ends and spring begins, inevitable and unremarkable. In April, Marian drove to the coast for a vacation. She rented a small cottage for a week, white with blue shutters, at the end of a gravel road near a beach she'd never been to. She packed light, clothes, books, a journal she'd been meaning to start. She drove alone, took her time, stopped at a diner for lunch, and arrived in the late afternoon. The cottage was simple, clean, with a tiny kitchen and a porch overlooking the water. She unpacked, walked to the beach, and stood at the water's edge, the wind pulling at her hair, the sound of the waves constant and soothing. She stayed for a week, walking every morning, reading in the afternoons, cooking simple meals, and sleeping better than she had in years. On her last day, she walked farther than usual, past the rocks and the tide pools, to a stretch of sand where she was the only person visible in either direction. She stood there for a long time, her feet in the cold water, and felt something settle inside her. Peace, maybe. Or just the absence of noise. When she returned home, the house felt different. Not empty. Full, but in a new way, full of her own rhythms, her own choices, her own silence. She unpacked, did laundry, watered the garden, and sat on the back porch with a cup of tea. The tomatoes were growing, the peppers starting to flower, the herbs thick and fragrant. She felt grateful. Not for what had happened, but for what she had made from it. By June, the garden was thriving. Marian picked vegetables almost every evening, enough to share with Helen and a few coworkers. She made salsa, froze some for winter, and gave the rest away. The raised bed had become a source of quiet pride, a project that required attention and patience and gave back in proportion. It was a small thing, a few square feet of plants, but it represented something larger, the ability to cultivate, to wait, to trust the process. On a Thursday evening in late June, 3 years to the day since she'd found the first receipt, Marian was in the garden, checking for pests, when she saw the first ripe tomato. It was perfect, deep red, firm, warm from the sun. She picked it carefully, carried it inside, and sliced it over the sink. She sprinkled it with salt and ate it slowly, the juice warm and sweet, the taste of summer. The clock in the hallway ticked. The light through the window was soft, golden. The house was quiet in the way it always was now, a quiet that felt like home. She washed the cutting board, set it to dry, and walked to her office. She opened the planner, looked at the calendar for the week ahead, work, book club, gardening club, a shift at the shelter, and felt content. Not happy in some exuberant way, but content. satisfied, at peace. She turned back through the planner, past the months of entries, past the notes and appointments and reminders, until she found the page from February 2021. The entry was still there, written in her careful handwriting. Begin telling the truth to myself. She read it, ran her finger over the ink, and then turned to a blank page near the back. She wrote one final line, dated it, and closed the book. The line read, "I kept my promise to myself." She sat there for a moment, the planner closed on her desk, the house quiet around her. Then she stood, turned off the light, and walked to the kitchen. She made tea, carried it to the living room, and sat by the window. The street was empty, the houses lit from within, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Every story here will stir your soul. Welcome to Spice and Sugar, your daily escape into real emotions, bold lives, and unforgettable lessons. Here, it's all about love, loss, laughter, and the quiet strength that carries us through. I share stories that make you feel, that remind you you're not alone, that every bitter moment can lead to something sweet. If you want to laugh, cry, and see life through stories that heal and inspire, subscribe and stay a while.